First off, a big apologies to colleagues who've had some IT issues, which is always the way with these things. Please bear with us. But I think we've got a jam-packed hour, so without further ado, I think we should get cracking, if that's okay. Firstly, just a good morning, a good afternoon, and a good evening to everyone. And thank you so much for joining today for the ZEV Regional Dialogues webinar on charging infrastructure. My name is Naomi White, and I'll be chairing the meeting today. If you go on to the next slide, please. Just a quick run through of the agenda. So I'll just provide a couple minutes on what the objectives of the meeting are, and then hand over to our colleagues in ICCT, who will provide a presentation on charging infrastructure deployment in emerging markets. There'll be a quick Q&A for about 15 minutes, and then there'll be a presentation from our colleagues at the IEA, who will kind of give an outline of a case study of support that they're working on for countries through the ZEV e-mobility programme. Again, there'll be a chance for Q&A, and then we'll wrap up the webinar. Just to mention as well, the slides will also be shared after the webinar as well. Next slide, please. And next one after that. Thank you. So just to give an overview of why we're meeting and the objectives really briefly. So many colleagues on the line may be familiar with the ZEV Regional Dialogues. We've organised a series of meetings in the past focused on each of the regions, and we're doing things a bit differently this time around. So we're running a webinar to share the latest analysis and case studies of support available to countries. We'll be doing 2 webinars this week, so one to cater, well, both to cater for different time zones. And in parallel, we're also doing a written consultation, which information should have already gone out to colleagues. But there's a link to the different, the online form in different languages, and the deadline is for completing the form is the 24th of June. And really, the aim here is to collect as many first-hand experiences and views from colleagues from both the public and private sector. And from that, we'll be able to, and the feedback from the webinars, we'll be able to develop recommendations that will come back to the international community in September. In terms of the webinar itself, so really it's to provide, as I mentioned, provide a latest analysis on what the global challenges are related to charging infrastructure and deployment and grid integration. Also an opportunity to showcase potential opportunities for to overcome shared challenges, examples of tools as well as resources available to countries, and provide countries with an opportunity to ask questions and share experiences with each other, as well as with the wider international community. On the written consultation, so the scope is slightly different, and really we're keen to understand the barriers and challenges different stakeholders face regarding charging infrastructure deployment and grid integration. We're also really keen to understand what case studies, so there's a range of fantastic work happening already all around the world, so we're really keen to hear from colleagues on what's happening, so that we can use this information to share with other colleagues, but also to inform future initiatives and existing initiatives as well. And then, importantly, understanding what more the international community can do to support accelerated deployments and grid integration around the world. So the consultation, as I mentioned, is linked here. We'll provide a follow-up with links as well in case colleagues have missed the initial email. And as mentioned, the recommendations from the webinar and the consultation will be fed back to the international community in September, but also the ZEV Transition Council ministers who will be meeting in September as well. I will now hand over to Alexander to lead on the ICCT presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Naomi. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Alexander Tenku. I'm an electric vehicle research associate at the International Council on Clean Transportation, or ICCT. And today my role will be to talk about the state of play of charging deployment in emerging markets. Next slide, please. So here I'm presenting the outline of my presentation. It will be composed of two parts. The first part is going to focus on the climate emergency and infrastructure development. And the second part, I'm going to discuss challenges, policy lever, the need for stakeholder coordination and business model to deploy charging infrastructure. Next slide, please. Next slide. All right, so recent research from ICCT conducted on behalf of the ZEV Zero Emission Vehicle Transition Council give us some understanding on the magnitude of the challenge when it comes to decarbonizing our economy. So among the important findings of that research is that with no new transport-related policies, emission will increase by 32% by 2050. And on the graph that I'm showing on the left, which shows CO2 emission projection according to different policy scenario, the 32% increase is that red line at the top that I just mentioned. So now, if we were to account proposed and announced policies by government, emission will increase by 14% by 2050. And this is represented by that purple wedge on that graph. So of course, 14% increase is better than a 30% increase. But as you can see from the graph, we're still very far away from the Paris Agreement target, which here are represented by the dashed yellow line for the 2 degrees Celsius target, and the green wedge by the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. Now, the good news is that through an accelerated ZEV transition, emission can be reduced by 73% by 2050. And this is represented on the graph by that blue wedge. And you can see that the ZEV transition actually takes us to a path that is compatible with meeting the 2 degrees Celsius target. Looking at the graph, you can see that we're actually getting slightly below that target, which of course is good news. So when it comes to the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, however, this one will be tough but not impossible. But it requires deploying measures that goes beyond the ZEV transition, such as, for example, increasing the efficiency of combustion engines that are still being introduced in the fleet. So the research finds that to be compatible with the 1.6 degree target, we will have to reduce emission by 40 to 60% by 2030 and by 80 to 90% by 2040 before emissions settle down to close to near zero by 2050. Next slide. So of course, it's good news to note that the ZEV transition takes us to a path that is at least compatible with the 2 Celsius degree target. But a successful ZEV transition cannot be conceived if we do not have a robust charging infrastructure. Effectively, the literature review, even though focused on light-duty vehicle, has consistently found a link between EV uptake and charging infrastructure deployment. And this is what I'm trying to show on the graph that I'm presenting here. So on the left, you have the EV stock growth over the past decade, so 2011, 2021. And on the right, you have the public charger stock growth over the same decade. And you can kind of almost see how they're growing in tandem. Indeed, charging infrastructure deployment and EV sales are intertwined. The same way that electric vehicles create the demand for charging infrastructure support EV uptake by reducing concern on range anxiety. However, as of today, most regions across the world have limited charging infrastructure, which limit the efficiency of their ZEV transition. Next slide. In the context of emerging markets, where several markets have already announced EV target cell, as I'm showing on this map, it therefore becomes critically important to develop the plan and the strategies to deploy the charging infrastructure that will make those targets achievable. Failure to do so can inhibit the ZEV transition in those markets. Next slide. So now, when it comes to assessing the status quo of charging infrastructure deployment in emerging markets, when we conducted our research, one of the first observations that we made is that it's difficult to assess the status quo. Why? Because we currently have limited or hard to access public reported data on EV charging deployment and how it compares to EV uptake. Now, for the few countries where we were able to find sufficient data, like for example, Thailand, which counted about 2,000 chargers and about 35,000 electric cars in 2001, we were able to estimate a ratio of 15 EVs per charger. And if you look at the green box on your right, that's sort of aligned with the EV to charger ratio that we saw in the US market back in 2021 as well. To cite an example, in the heavy-duty vehicle segment in Chile in April of 2022, the city counted over 800 electric buses for about 377 public chargers, giving us a ratio of about 2 EVs per charger. So one thing that's important to mention is that even though the EV to ratio is a commonly used measure to kind of give us a sense of how robust the charging infrastructure of a given market can be, other parameters need to be taken in consideration to really understand how the demand from EV is met by the charging infrastructure that is in place. Those parameters include, for example, the amount of charging that happens at home, the location of the chargers, or the range of the vehicle that are being used. Next slide, please. So even in a country where we're not necessarily able to calculate the EV to charger ratio, we find through media articles many indications that several EMDAs are taking action to deploy charging infrastructure. In the two-wheeler segment, for example, Vietnam is developing more than 150,000 charging ports that will be compatible for both electric cars and motorbikes. Looking specifically into the light-duty segment, the national utility in Ghana is working with POBAT International to facilitate the installation of 200 charging stations in key areas. In the heavy-duty segment, very similarly, Ukraine partnered with Caris, a technology firm, to manufacture 5,000 electric buses and more than 7,000 charging stations. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the type of technologies, charging technologies that we're seeing in those countries, one important point is that as of 2022, most emerging markets rely on imports to acquire the charging infrastructure, equipment. And those chargers can be roughly categorized in two main categories. So you will have the so-called normal charger that provides slow to intermediate speed with AC current. And then you will have the fast or rapid charger that provide fast charging services with DC current. Also worth noting is that for the heavy duty segment, megawatt chargers are in development and they will be able to accommodate heavy duty vehicle by providing fast charging services. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the charging strategies, and by charging strategies, we refer to the practices that different user case will adopt in order to make charging event as convenient and cost-effective as possible. We see that the window of opportunity to charge will ultimately determine the cost of charging. So what do I mean by that is that drivers will have the opportunity to charge over a long period of time. So let's say, for example, overnight at home or at a depot. They will be able to rely on a normal charger and will tend to be subject to lower charging cost. Reversely, drivers that have a busier schedule or unpredictable itinerary, they can be accommodated by a fast charger, but this would typically involve higher charging costs because the cost of charging will include additional fees such as like capital expenditure or operational expenditure. We also saw that battery swapping is fairly common in the E2 and E3 wheeler segment because of their relatively smaller size when compared to light duty vehicle or heavy duty vehicle. So if you want, the process of swiping the battery does not involve a costly labor and can be done within a short period of time. Next slide. So that concludes my part one. Next slide. So when it comes to the challenges for charging infrastructure deployment, through a rigorous literature review that we conducted here at ICCT, but also from the previous regional dialogue, we were able to identify at least 5 major challenges for the deployment of charging infrastructure. The first one has to do with the costly upfront cost of charging infrastructure and the lack of a business model. indeed. So we all know that governments are often confronted with limited public resources, financial resources. So they're looking for innovative approach that can help them overcome the upfront cost barrier of charging infrastructure. Unfortunately, we kind of realize that under the current literature review, business models are not described with sufficient amount of details, which makes it hard to replicate. The second challenge that we identify has to do with the development of charging strategies or plan. So ideally, every market should have a plan on a strategy for charging infrastructure that will bring all stakeholders under a common vision, and it will also send strong signal for private investment. Ideally, that strategy will propose targets. It will identify a good mix between public and private charging stations, and it will also identify the priority areas where those charging stations need to be installed. The third challenge that we identify is the lack of technical standard, which harmonize the charging infrastructure, both in terms of hardware, so we're talking about plugs, sockets, connectors, but also in terms of like software that allow charging stations to communicate with the grid and electric vehicles and between themselves. This is often referred to as interoperability in the literature review. So when those standards are in place, the charging infrastructure becomes hassle-free, user-friendly, and safe. For example, EV drivers are not confronted with different payment methods, which are inconvenient. A fourth challenge that we identify is the lack of technical expertise, which expose emerging market to potentially higher installation cost, but also maintenance cost. But it also reduces opportunity for the for the development of a local manufacturing supply chain that will be more reliable and more adapted for those markets. And finally, we also identify grid capacity as one of the challenge, because as emerging market progress in the ZEV transition, there will be an increasing load of electric vehicle on the grid. There's therefore a need to make sure that the grid will be robust enough to intake that additional load. But as we heard from the previous regional dialogue, as of today, several emerging markets are already confronted with shortage of electricity and high cost of electricity because of the grid that lack a certain capacity. And I want to quickly take this opportunity to again remind everyone about the ongoing consultation survey. It will give opportunity to input key challenges for your country or specific regions, and it will therefore help us to formulate recommendations that are the most helpful for you. Next slide, please. So now when it comes to the supporting practices for charging deployment, we follow a similar approach. We conducted a literature review and we identify a few of them. Some of them, as you can see, most of them actually are already being adopted by emerging market, while others can serve as, we're seeing them more in the leading market, and they can serve as general guidance for emerging market who can then adapt them based on their political and socioeconomic situation. One of the emerging or supporting practices that we identify is the development of a strategy or a plan. And Belarus is a good example of an emerging market that has developed a plan. The plan is composed of 3 phases. And the first phase, which went from 2018 to 2021, aimed at the installation of 431 charging stations. Overall, the plan is aiming for 1,300 charging stations installed by 2030. Another supporting practices that we identify is the development of incentive program. So in the short term, countries can put in place incentive programs that help address the upfront cost of charging infrastructure. We see that in many countries already, such as like Cape Verde, Egypt, Rwanda, who offer those incentives as tax exemption on charging infrastructure import. In the longer term, however, what will be important is to secure long-term finance through the international institution and the private sector. And we saw that, for example, a country like Cape Verde have been able to secure funding through the NAMA facility project. A third practice that we identify is standardizing charging infrastructure. And we actually saw that certain countries like India, that India is an interesting case study because under the recent revision of their guidelines and standard for EV charging infrastructure, they have standardized all the connectors for electric vehicle across all vehicle segment. Another emerging practices that we highlight, that the literature review highlighted, is the reduced electricity tariffs. So reduced electricity tariffs are important because there is a need to ensure that owning and operating an electric vehicle is affordable and compare favorably to a conventional vehicle. It's also important because it could encourage the utilizations of chargers that are being installed, which are critical to ensure their economic viability. Another important practice has to do with upgrading and managing the grid. So upgrading the grid might be needed in cases where, for example, the electricity load coming from the electric vehicle cannot be handled with the current capacity that we have. So we will, for example, build additional power plant, additional transmission line. But what's also important to recognize is that managing the grid is also important. It consists essentially of like distributing the load throughout the day so that the grid never feel overwhelmed. And this can be done through dynamic pricing schemes or smart charging programs that pretty much encourage charging events during periods where demand for electricity is low. We were not necessarily able to identify most of those practices in emerging countries as of now, but here where we're based in the US, we have like state like California who through its utility already offer these kind of services to their client. And finally, the last one that we wanted to discuss today, the last emerging practice that we wanted to discuss today has to do with building codes. So building codes are essentially mandates that require that retrofitted buildings or new buildings be equipped with charging infrastructure. So they can be used to increase charging access within cities. Next slide. Okay, so even above the need for policies that can support charging infrastructure deployment, there is a need to enable the environment. And how do we enable the environment? We believe that it goes by establishing strong coordinations among relevant stakeholders. With those strong collaboration, different stakeholders can synergize effort to accelerate charging infrastructure deployment. So on the graph that I'm showing here, you can see sort of like an example of like how, what are those stakeholders that need to come together around the same table to synergize their effort. And each of them will typically have like a specific role to play. So you have, for example, governments putting in place the best policies and regulation for charging deployment. You have the private sector bringing the finance. You have EV drivers sharing their experience. You have charging point operator installing and maintaining charging infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. So if you want, with that enabled environment and with that strong coordination among relevant stakeholders, a lot of great things can happen for the ZEV transition in general, but also for the charging infrastructure deployment more specifically. And among those things that can happen is like the emergence of like new business models. So we came to realize that those business models already exist. They have started to emerge in different places of the world. And focusing on the planning and role distribution, they help answering key questions such as who install and maintain charging infrastructure, what is the role of the utility, and how do we finance the charging equipment. What's important to know also is that those business models do not fit into like a one-size-fits-all model. They can literally change from a market to another. Next slide, please. So even though there's no one-size-fits-all model for business models, we can discuss them in very broad terms. We can classify them in three broad classifications. One would be government-driven, where the government takes the lead for the business plan. Typically, it will use its own land. It will provide its own land where the charging infrastructure can be installed. The equipment will be secured through the private sector, usually through like a public-private partnership. And then charging point operators will typically be the one installing and managing the charging infrastructure, and they can be helped with like eventual incentive that the government has to offer. The other broad category will be referred to as consumer driven. So in this business model, the lead is taken by consumers. So we're talking about like private businesses such as like shopping mall. We're talking about like private EV fleet, private EV drivers, or we're talking about like electric vehicle taxi fleet, for example. So in this case, they will either own the land where they can install the charging infrastructure, or they will lease it from a third party. For the charging equipment, they will rely on charging point operators or other retailer shop that may have that kind of equipment. And the charging point operator would typically be the one installing and maintaining that infrastructure. And finally, we have the service provider driven business model, which will include charging point operators or utilities. Typically, they will have the land to install those infrastructure. They will own it. They will get the equipment from their manufacturing partner, and they will also typically be the one installing and managing that infrastructure. Next slide, please. So yeah, so this pretty much conclude my quick overview of the state of play of charging infrastructure. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me and my team if we can be helpful in any way. And as of now, we are more than happy. I want to thank you for your attention, and we are more than happy to answer any question that you may have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexander. That was really interesting, and hopefully colleagues found that really insightful as well. Zafay and Zoe, I welcome your help with inviting colleagues into the discussion. As Zafay's mentioned, feel free to put a comment in or come in and unmute yourself to ask a question of Alexander in case you've got any questions at all. We've got about 7 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next item.
Yes, and feel free to add your questions to the questions box in the control panel, and we can answer them there or in the chat if that is more convenient.
And colleagues, do feel free to share, like, do the challenges that Alexander outlined and the opportunities, do they resonate with you and kind of resonate with what your experiences are? We'd welcome any insights at all. Just wait another minute or so. I can't see any questions or hands or anything.
It looks like Winston, I think Winston could chime in with some info on South Africa.
Winston, please take the floor.
Let me unmute you, Winston. All right, you should be unmuted, Winston.
Thank you very much. I think I said what I wanted to. We've been quite involved in the development of the South African highway project, which basically all major highways are covered with chargers now every 200 kilometers. So it literally means that EVs can drive anywhere in the country. That was achieved in South Africa before we even had 800 vehicles on the road. So it was a very, very early initiative that ran here, and I think it really has helped to get the OEMs to be a lot more confident to bring products into the market, etc. So we'd be happy to look to helping to provide some information around the case study focused on the region. We are also working with 3 other initiatives that and it's not too difficult to work out. It's the 3 countries closest to South Africa. And within the next year, they'd probably all be in a very similar space to what we are. So we've been discussing that strategy of approaching chargers on the highways at certain distances to open up the long distance driving. I think from my view of it, different to places like Europe, the real enabler in Africa is going to be long distance driving. Well, certainly in South Africa, because everybody can charge at home. So we've got pretty good electricity, in the home. So your vehicle is pretty much always full if you're near your home. Whereas driving longer distances is where the challenge comes. And for us, those distances are big, across the country, over 2,000 kilometers.
Thank you, Winston. That was really insightful. And I think, and thank you for your previous engagement as well with the regional dialogues, as I remember like examples of potential, I don't know, cross-continent opportunities for collaboration related to long-distance charging infrastructure. And perhaps this is something that we can pick up and dig into a bit more detail about how and whether that's something we could kind of develop further. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing your insights, and I think I would be keen to follow up to find out more with you directly.
Absolutely, very happy to share.
Thank you so much. So I'll go over to you. I still can't see hands, unfortunately. Sorry, everyone.
Maybe if I can just add one other note.
Yes, please do.
That is, I think what really helped us in South Africa, and I think certainly should be part of any, let's say, other African country looking to get into this space, and that really is to drive the software side of it. So in South Africa, the first electric vehicles arrived in 2014. We started in 2010 developing the back-end systems that manage the payments, manage the connections of the charging stations, maintenance routines, all of that sort of thing. So a big part of what we believe is the enabler is the correct establishment of the right sort of systems in a country before the vehicles even arrive in the country, that you really get control over that process as quickly as possible. So for example, we have a single payment system, and I think anybody from Europe, normally when we tell them that, they say, oh my gosh, that's amazing. So, and I think that was just because we were able to move early before the vehicles were here and really put down the rules that says, this is how it works, this is what we should be using, this is the approach. It doesn't mean we'll always have a single payment, but at this stage, it really is a single payment system that is fairly well supported. And we're taking a similar approach in the regional discussions with other countries as well, to look to establishing that platform within those countries and really putting the right message across that says you need to manage these things earlier rather than later. Working with smart connected chargers, all those sort of things.
Thank you for that. That's really insightful, and it just shows that there's a lot of opportunity to follow up and find out where's the opportunity to strengthen that international collaboration with regions, and sharing your experiences as well. Because I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from each other in this area. So thank you again, and we'll follow up separately. Do colleagues have any? Zifei and Zoe, sorry, I keep calling on you. Are there any other questions or hands raised before we move on to the next presentation?
We had a hand up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Hi, this is Paul from the High Commission in Namibia. Apologies, I actually joined this thing halfway. We had some technical issues due to, I guess, security issues. But Alexander, I heard your presentation was really interesting. So I have sort of two questions. One linked to my colleague in South Africa who just spoke, and one to you. So as an overview, Namibia's recent NDC has made huge commitments when it comes to having electric vehicles on the road, which obviously from the UK's perspective is a great sign of leadership and is quite exemplary. But there are some challenges in terms of it really feels like this is a starting from scratch project. There are very few vehicles on the road in Namibia. And I suppose somewhat similar to my colleague in South Africa, Namibia has, I don't know if any of you have been, it's a very large country where communities and cities are very spread apart, right? So you can drive for hours without seeing absolutely anybody before you actually get to a town. And I think in these early discussions, I'd just be very curious to understand maybe your view and your experience on how to work with government on a business model where there isn't an existing or clear evidence of an existing demand for electric vehicles, and in a country where you have very long haul distances that are mostly traveled probably by tourists and probably a few who travel during holidays to sort of the northern western parts of the country. So just to understand how you'd advise building that kind of model. And then to my South African colleague, I'd be very keen to have a chat with you about how you've approached things. There are always a lot of similarities between Namibia and South Africa. So I'd be very keen to chat through that, and I'll put my email in the chat room for a follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question and the two questions. And I think absolutely, yes, let's follow up licensee separately. But Alexander, did you want to come in with some remarks, some brief reflections, and then we'll have to move on to the next presentation.
I'm just going to put my contact details in. I don't know if the questions come through to everybody, but please feel free to share. I would love to have a discussion about Namibia. We do have some probably really good insight of what's going on there as well. So we do have a local person in Namibia working with us in some of the work that we're doing. So I think the time is very opportune to have a discussion.
That's perfect, thank you. And yes, I've just seen the email address come up, so we definitely need to follow up with yourself and also Winston, of course, as well, separately, because there's a lot to discuss. Alexander, did you want to share any final reflections before we move on to the IEA?
Not necessarily at this point, except the fact that I wanted to acknowledge those challenges and kind of share also our experience with like what we've been able to see so far regarding the business models is that it's kind of like challenging to put them in place because they're really depending on the local context. So as of now, we're still trying to kind of like identify if you know, there's at least some sort of blueprint that could be applied to like countries that have, for example, the profile that you just described. So countries where most of the driving doesn't necessarily happen close to home, but like in long distance travel. But as of now, at least based on everything that I've seen so far, I can't think the top of my head of like an approach that I've kind of like discussed this specific context, but looking forward to definitely look more into it and definitely to follow up on that.
Thank you, Alexander. And we might actually touch on some of this in the next presentation, actually. So I'd like to invite Julia Guyon from the IEA, who's going to present on recent and planned activities of the Global Environment Facility Working Group on Charging Infrastructure and Grid Integration. Julia, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Julia Guyon. I'm an energy analyst with the International Energy Agency, and I will be talking a little bit about our ZEV-funded e-mobility program, more specifically going into the activities of the working group on charging infrastructure and grid integration, and highlighting some of the main findings of our policy brief on public charging infrastructure that we released at the end of April. If you could go into the next slide. And the next one, please. Thank you. So this is an overview of the ZEV global program to support countries with the shift to electric mobility. So it's a program that has been launched at COP in September, and we had the first working group meetings towards the end of the year 2021. And we are now really launching into these global thematic working groups. As you can see here, there are 2 of those working groups that are led by the IEA, the electric light duty vehicles, and the working group 4, which is highlighted here because that's the one I will be more talking about, on charging, grid integration, renewable power supply, and batteries. And then we have 2 working groups which are led by UNEP, the electric heavy duty vehicles, and the 2 3-wheelers. In addition to these global working groups, we have regional platforms that are coordinating on the regional level and country projects which have on-site demonstrations. Currently, there are 30+ country projects. If you could go to the next slide, please. Sorry, I think there was one that was jumped. No, one before. Yeah, exactly. So just to give an overview of what this working group 4 on charging infrastructure, grid integration, and batteries is doing. So really the objective is to develop knowledge materials. These materials are shared with governments to help them advance the rollout of electric mobility. And here again, of course, the focus is really the charging infrastructure and the grid aspects, so system integration and the reuse of batteries. In this frame, we have several deliverables. In end of April, we have this published this policy brief on public charging infrastructure. This is available on the IEA website for free. In November, we will provide a policymaker manual on electric vehicle grid integration. And we are currently also developing an interactive web tool to assess electric vehicle charging loads. A first version will be developed by the summer, and then we plan to release the actual final version in March 2023. And in the batteries part, we aim to have by the end of 2023 a report analyzing the life cycle and repurposing of electric vehicle batteries. So this brings me to the next slide and to the findings of this policy brief on public charging infrastructure. The idea being to look at how to promote successful rollout strategies and business models for electric vehicle infrastructure. And you have seen the first presentation of our colleagues from ICCT. It aligns quite well. So I will be quite quick on this slide because I think everyone here in the room knows that to get to net zero, the road transport sector is actually one of the key sectors to decarbonize, and that one of the main levers we have to do it so is electrify road transport. And as we've seen in the previous presentation, if we want electric vehicles to develop, we need electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And that's really something that governments need to have a look at in order to deploy electrification of transport. So if we could go to the next slide, we will dive a bit deeper into the charging infrastructure and the different business models, the diversity of charging infrastructure actually, because compared to a internal combustion engine, one thing that is really different with electric vehicles is that we can charge it in very different locations. And you will see that different business models will apply, different charging speeds, different types of services will apply for these different locations. If we start now, we will start with roadside charging. If you could go to the next slide, please. Exactly, thank you. So roadside charging is something we define as charging on a public parking, usually in the city. Maybe I should note here that this policy brief really focused on public charging locations, so we will mostly address these locations. For roadside charging, all charging speeds will be possible. It's slow charging for overnight or longer duration parking, but it could also be fast charging hubs in cities. This will complement, sorry. Yeah, okay, I'll continue. This will complement or replace home charging, and the aim is really that you allow people to charge that don't have access to home charging. Grid services here will be possible, especially if you have longer dwell times. We go to the next location, we will have a look at what we call en route charging. Next slide, please. Thank you. In en route charging, this is something that you will do to top up when you go from A to B. And so in this case, it will mostly be fast charging because it's something that you want to do while you're traveling. Your aim is to reach your destination, so you want a quick top up and continue your journey. So that's also why we say grid services here will be more limited, because the emphasis is on the charging speed. Looking at the next location, we will have a look at, oops, that was one too much. Yes, destination charging. Destination charging is defined as basically, in my example, from A to B, you charge at the point B. This point B can be a shopping mall, it can be a hospital, it can be a hotel, an amusement park, whichever destination you're driving to, you're staying for a while and then you're going back. In this case, all types of charging speeds will be possible. It will really depend on the dwell time at destination. A shopping mall will not have the same kind of needs than an amusement park, for example. The motivations for this business owner is to attract business to its destination. It's an additional revenue stream. And of course, it's also attractive to be able to say, okay, if you come to our shopping mall, if you come to our place, you can charge your car while you do your shopping. So it's really an attractiveness factor. In this case as well, grid services are possible. It will really depend on the dwell times again. And moving to the next location, we're talking here about shared home or work charging. Again, because we have a focus on public charging, this is something that is less used currently, but that has started to develop via community charging applications. In this setting, a charger that is, for example, at home or at work is shared with someone else through a platform. It will primarily be slow charging. It can be an additional revenue for the owner of the charger. And of course, from a more system point of view, it's a very efficient use of existing infrastructure if this charger is used by more people. And grid services here are possible since it's primarily slow charging. And moving to the last point, we will talk a bit about battery swapping. This has been mentioned as well already in the first presentation. This is something that is location independent, so you can have battery swapping stations at different locations. It's a bit different in the sense that you will not plug in your vehicle, but swap the battery, the discharged battery, for a full battery. This can considerably reduce charge times and allow swaps at off-grid locations, because you could charge the batteries at another location and bring them to these locations. It helps also to have a quicker battery maintenance. And it's something that is very popular currently with 2-3-wheelers, as my colleague mentioned in the previous presentation. Grid services here would be possible at the battery charging site. And this brings me to our main recommendations. If we can go exactly, thank you, to the next slide. So after analyzing these different points, we have put together 5 main recommendations to policymakers to ensure an efficient rollout of charging infrastructure. The first one being breaking down the silos. One clear aspect of electric vehicles is that it's not only one sector that is concerned. It is transport, but also energy, also real estate, urban structures. All these different sectors need to come together and engage into cross-sectoral discussion and you also need to have cooperation at different levels, from the national to the very local level, because people that will do the national policies need to also understand what the local level needs. So for this, having designated contact persons, the adequate capacity building, and also creating cross-sectoral working groups is recommended. We go to the next recommendation. Would be to tailor your strategy, your charging infrastructure deployment strategy to your own jurisdiction. Charging electric vehicles is very diverse, so you can adapt it very clearly to your jurisdiction. For that, you first need to obtain a clear picture of the needs of the challenges by collecting the relevant data. We had a great example before from our colleague in Namibia that mentioned that in Namibia you would have very long distances traveled between the cities. So there it would be interesting to see, okay, is this the majority of the people? Are the majority of the people actually driving those long distances? Are these the low-hanging fruits? In that case, I would have to tailor my charging infrastructure strategy to that. And of course, there is another aspect to the strategy, is to also take into account transport strategies at a whole. If there are modal shifts that are possible, try to take them into account into your planning and to encourage them to be able to have an efficient deployment of charging infrastructure. Then if we go to the third recommendation, it's to showcase electric vehicle charging as a political priority and attract investment. Why are we saying this? Because the public sector won't be able to install all the electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We need the private sector to come in, to invest, and to have some competition to ensure that we have the highest quality of equipment. And to do so, we encourage governments to have clear targets, clear plans of the number of electric vehicles, the number of charging infrastructure that they want to have in their jurisdictions, because this will clearly show to investors that this is at the top of the agenda. To get to the next one, this is also something mentioned by the ICCT. It's encouraging standardization. This is very important for the user to ensure that he or she has access to reliable charging infrastructure. It's great if the government can select codes and standards up front to ensure that we don't have a mix of different standards, but have a clear targeted infrastructure that everyone can use. And interoperability is really a key word here. If we have a charging station that a charge point operator, that cannot operate the stations anymore, it's great if we have interoperability protocols to be able to switch the operator. And that brings me to the last point. The last point being future-proof your infrastructure. We don't want to invest into infrastructure that is obsolete in 2 years. So first of all, build your targets into the planning, and then also promote smart metering and smart charging. Why? Because this will allow electric vehicle charging to have the lowest impact on the grid, and it will allow for dynamic charging and also to encourage the use of low carbon electricity. For example, by setting signals to charge, to set the prices, for example, to be the lowest when there is a high solar PV availability, as an example. And that brings me to the end of my present. Oh, no, sorry. First have to talk a bit about the next steps. So the next steps of the working group, if you could go to the next slide, are the interactive web tool on electric vehicle charging load assessment, which will be released in the first version in the next few weeks. And then after the summer, we will have an introduction and consultation with stakeholders through regional workshops. And then the policy manual on grid integration, our second main deliverable, is something that is a work in progress. We are currently preparing a policy framework for electric vehicle grid integration, and we will send this policy manual for external peer review in October. And that brings me now to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and of course, I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Julia. That was really interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have 10 minutes for questions, but there was, I'll put one question in, and just to come back on Winstone's point that we will send more information on the survey that was mentioned earlier. We'll include links to got the survey in English, French, Spanish, and Russian, so colleagues can fit it in. But we'll send information on that along with the slides after the webinar. Just a quick question from Gustavo. Does the project consider funding initial charging infrastructure pilots for cities?
So among the ZEV project, there are country projects in which there is demonstration and pilots. So this is something that is ongoing. The country projects have in some countries started, and in some countries they haven't yet, but the idea is really to exchange with those pilots and exchange knowledge and expertise, and try to get also feedback from those pilot projects on the relevance of our deliverables.
Thanks, Julia. It's unfortunate we don't have time for any further questions, but as mentioned, we can follow up via email. We'll be sending a follow-up with the slides, with contact details of all the speakers, as well as links to the survey as well for colleagues to fill out this week. But firstly, just want to say a massive thank you to our speakers, and a massive thank you to each and every one of you for taking the time to join. I'm so sorry that it's been quite a condensed session, but we hope you found it really insightful and helpful. We welcome any feedback at all, of course. And just to really summarise, I mean, we've heard about the emerging policy levers and practices. We've heard about the role of stakeholders and synergising efforts. Business models, we've heard about different case studies, including the ZEV-funded electromobility programme. As outlined by Julia just now, we've heard about the country experiences, the different tools that are being developed, all within a space of 1 hour. So it's certainly been a busy session. In terms of next steps, so as I mentioned, we'll send an email with the slides and the contact details and the links to the written consultation. Thank you to colleagues who have shared their email addresses. We'll follow up direct as well. If anyone else would like to share their email addresses so that we can follow up, by all means do in the chat, and we will be in touch. And as mentioned, the recommendations from the conversations we've had today, the conversations we'll have at the webinar on Thursday, but also importantly, the recommendations as well from the written consultation will be condensed down and by ICCT. And will be presented to the international community on how and where the international support can be strengthened based on the real life experiences and views of countries. And last but not least, a massive thank you again for taking the time. We hope you found it helpful and look forward to continuing to work with you. Thank you.